And we're live. Hello, everybody. If you're on already, or if you're coming on, I don't see anybody in the chat window, but Andrew is here. We will jump right in and get started on our new year of Bible study. Already, or if you're coming on. Oh, see, I'm out of practice, so I forgot to mute this. Yeah, we muted it. Okay, there we go. All right, so all my technical difficulties. As far as years go, this is the least technical difficulty we've had the first one. Let's see if that holds true the whole time. We'll start off with the prayer. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, shine within our hearts, loving Master, with pure light of divine knowledge, and open the eyes of our minds to the understanding of the message of your gospel teachings. Instill within us also the reverence for your blessed commandments, that having trampled upon carnal desires, we may enter the spiritual way of living, both thinking and doing only those that are well pleasing to you. For you, Christ, our God, our sanctification and illumination, do we give glory together to the Father without beginning, all good, life, and Spirit, now and forever, in the ages of ages. Amen. Uh-oh. Okay. Very good. So there's Mary Jo. Hello. So I know we have Mary Jo here, and the 6 viewers, so everybody's coming along. So welcome to St. Luke Greek Orthodox Church Bible Study. My beard has gotten longer since, if you're not in the parish, and if I slouch just right, then my beard actually looks like it's longer because it goes off the screen, but I'll try to sit up straight. I keep looking over there because I've got my stack of books. I'm going to go through and show you what I have. I actually got a book of illuminated Psalms, and I'd like to show them, but I'm having technical difficulties on that because I didn't realize the screen is mirrored image, so it's actually opposite. So if I show you something with writing on it, for instance, like this, it's going the wrong way. So I'm not really sure what to do about that. So I might try to scan a picture and maybe include, but I don't know how to include it on the video. But anyway, those are the problems that I'm debating right now. As far as getting started with the Psalms, we'll do an introduction today. We won't go through each of the Psalms individually step by step because there's 150 of them. So if we try doing like we usually do a chapter a day, we'd be doing this for the next 3 years, right? Wow. So, or chapter a week, I mean. So they do come in groups, which we'll talk about in a minute. But as I want to do on our the first Bible study, I will show you the resources I'm going to be using. And it's a little bit different because this year I don't have, I kind of have my standard collection of stuff that I do. I've got my word commentary. I've got my N.T. Wright commentary. I've got Father Lawrence Farley's commentary. I've got St. John Chrysostom, all the groups. So the Psalms, we don't have that because it's the Old Testament, so it's different. So I inquired of my trusty professor at Duke Divinity School, Dr. Ellen Davis, who's wonderful, and she gave me some really good suggestions. So without further ado, one of the books I'll be looking at the most is this one by Robert Alter, who's probably one of the top Old Testament scholars right now, but he's also he's a poet. And so he sees the poetry of the Psalms and gives close attention to the poetry, which I think is really important as we're looking at the Psalms. And then this is James Mays has a commentary on the Psalms, and this will be kind of my more academically based one that's going to have some of the references that I can check into. And the other kind of Protestant commentary that I have is this Brazos theological commentary. And I'll tell you, she's interesting because she's not interested in Christological references in the Psalms, and she wants to read without that. So that could be really interesting to see what she does that, especially since there is the Lamb of God is the very front cover of the book too. So I don't know what we're going to do with that, but that's going to be very interesting to figure out. Now, to keep us grounded, we have some patristic commentaries. We have St. Augustine's exposition of the Psalms, and we have, of course, St. John, don't drop the book, St. John Chrysostom's commentary on the Psalms. And I'll talk a little bit about the history of kind of interpretation because it's going to help us with it. A couple other books that I will reference, but just very briefly, this one is on praying the Psalms, which I think is really cool. There's an article or there's an essay on that, which I'll talk a little bit about today because I think it's important for us. And everybody's coming up. Oh, it shows up fine. It's not mirrored. Oh, that's perfect. So it's just on my screen that it looks mirrored. Awesome. And the last thing is Messianic Revelation in the Old Testament. And this is kind of short too. There's not, because this is the whole Old Testament. So the chapter of the Psalms is probably all about maybe that long. So it's not that big of a deal. Maybe that long. So there we go. So those are our commentaries. Then, if you've never seen this, this is the Ancient Faith Psalter. It's a really good resource to have. I've been trying to do it, but I have not been particularly faithful. But they actually have it broken into the Kathisma. So the Kathisma it basically means sections or readings. And so if you look at the table of contents, it's got, Sunday Vespers, and then Matins. There's an A and a B, and then Monday, Matins A and B, Vespers, Tuesday, Matins A and B, and Vespers, and it goes all the way through the week. If you follow this, you'll actually read through the entire Psalter each week. And this, of course, this is a monastic tradition. They do this in monasteries. But each kathisma, or setting, is probably about 3 or 4 psalms, and it's maybe 10 pages. It takes me 10 minutes to read a kathisma. But it's a really good practice to pray the Psalms, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. That the Psalms are the prayer book of the church, so it's not actually of the synagogue and the church, which is pretty cool. But the Psalms, they don't yield their insights to study the same way that some of the letters do. These are something that you actually have to encounter and enter into, and as you would with any poetry. And as anybody who knows me, I'm not a poet. Like at school, I liked prose. I don't like poetry, because prose means A, B, C, and D, and it means A, B, C, and D. You don't have to worry about it. And poetry means Q, or purple or soft. I mean, I don't know. It's just, like what is the sound of, what is the sound of purple? It's a color, it doesn't have sound. But that's what the Psalter does. That's what the Psalms do. Is they're poetic language, which means they're self-defeating language, which means that they always say more than they say, and that's how they lead us into the mystery of God. So I'm going to need commentary and help with this, because it's just not my strength. Like I said, I like black and white and very intellectual and methodical and everything else. Now, the other cool little thing I have that I want to do is, on Dr. Ellen Davis's recommendation, I got this book, I Will Wake the Dawn, which has illuminated psalms. So as we read the psalm, I will have this up on the screen. So Stephanie, let me know if that actually shows up properly, because I want to talk about these too. And the art actually has commentary in the art. Like, for instance, this one, it's a tree, and it's got 12 pomegranates, 12 because the 12 nations of Israel, and then the pomegranates legend had it, they had 613 seeds in each pomegranate. And of course, 613 is the number of commandments in the Old Testament. And then, of course, it's a harp, because Psalms have always been associated with David. And there's all kinds of stuff on here. And then the little chaff is being blown away, because you'll hear about the wicked blown as chaff away. But anyway, so that's kind of the thought in the books that I will be trying to reference as we do our Bible study together. Ooh, pretty. Thank you, Kane. All right, good. So it looks like it shows up properly. So, and I'm going to keep my eye on the chat because I do want this to be a little bit more interactive, and we're probably going to need to talk a little bit, because we got to figure out how we're going to do the Psalms, because there's, like I said, 150 of them. So we're not going to get through all of them. We'll get through some of them, and we probably need to decide how we're going to go about doing that. But before we do that, let me tell you about the Psalms, and I'll give us a little bit of information so we can go from it. So the first thing is that the Psalms are a collection of liturgical poetry. So you talk about genres in Scripture, you've got the Gospels, you've got the epistles, you've got the letters. In the Old Testament, you have kind of 3 main divisions. You have the Torah, or the law, and then you have the history, and you have what they call the writings. I think it's the Ketuvim or something like that in Hebrew. I should probably learn Hebrew before I do this, but I don't have time. So if you put those 3 divisions together, you have the whole thing. So you have, it's the law and the prophets. So the law, the prophets, and the writings are kind of the big divisions. But anyway, you've got histories like Joshua and 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles. You've got prophecies like you have in Ezekiel and Obadiah and Jonah and all these others. And then you have these poetic writings. The poetic writings are mostly Job would be considered that. And by the way, Job is the oldest, it's generally accepted as the oldest writing within all the scriptures. So it was the first composed book. It's kind of cool. Job. Yeah. It kind of surprised you, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
Oh, by the way, I am prepared for the hurricane. See, I have smart water. And it's like a jug of it. Anyway, so then you also have the Song of Songs, and you have the Psalms, and you have the Proverbs, and those are all kind of poetic books. But the Psalms, of course, hold a huge place within the life of the church. They're quoted more than anything else in the Old Testament in the New Testament. Even indirectly quoted, even indirectly, they show up, of course, Christ on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? Is Psalm 22. So they play a very important role within the life of the church. And we're going to talk about that role. But it is a collection. So it was not like somebody just wrote the book of Psalms. It's not, it doesn't have a beginning and an end and a middle in the sense that a narrative book would have. It seems to be that Psalm 1 was intended as an introduction to the entire book. And it does seem even more strongly that Psalm 150 was meant as a conclusion for the whole book. So they were purposefully put 1 and 150 to open and close the Psalms. So we got that. Usually we talk about tradition has that. A little T tradition, not whole tradition. Little T tradition has that David was the author of the Psalms. That is likely entirely true. As a matter of fact, it's certainly not entirely true because some of the Psalms themselves are ascribed to other people, whether Moses or the sons of Korah or the Asaphites, or I think there's 3 or 4 different groups that are attributed to Psalms. The other really notorious thing about studying the Psalms, as opposed to just praying them or just reading them, but in studying them, is that it is nearly impossible to get any kind of scholarly consensus or kind of critical evidence to date the Psalms. You just can't. They're poetry, so they kind of defy that. There's one psalm that talks about, by the waters of Babylon we wept, and so that was after the exile. That's the only one that can even, I have 150, that's the only one that can be dated with any kind of, not even certainty, but with any kind of surety. So one of the things that modern commentaries really shy away from is what they call historicizing the Psalms. So say, this is the psalm that David prayed when. This is the psalm that David did when. This is the psalm that they did when the temple was dedicated. This is the psalm that Solomon said when this happened. Now, having said that, a lot of the Psalms are very clearly meant to be used at particular liturgical services within the life of the church. I mean, even some, there's a wedding psalm in there, so there's particular liturgical uses for many of the Psalms. And they were most likely sung. And we'll talk about the actual kind of poetic form of the Psalms a little bit because it's very interesting. And I didn't know all of it. I mean, I knew about poetry, I knew some of the parallelism and that stuff, but not the depth of it that I learned the last week. But so the Psalms, the most broad definition is it is a collection of sung liturgical poetry. But that's broadly defined because some of them are used for private prayer. Some of them were private prayers that have now become corporate collective prayers, like Psalm 50 with the one that I do when I'm sensing, have mercy on me, O God, according to your great mercy, and according to your abundant mercy about my transgressions, and wash me thoroughly from my sins, and cleanse me from my transgressions. For I know my sins, and my sins are before me. But anyway, and then some of them were not chanted, but they were read. Like the one that said is it by the waters of Babylon? Anyway, I've read so many lately that I'm getting them mixed up. But it actually says we cannot sing anymore. I mean, it actually is talking about not being able to be sung. But the majority of the Psalms are written to be sung, and that is one of the major challenges in translation because Hebrew is an extraordinarily compact language. And so, for instance, Psalm 23, which is, the Lord is my shepherd and I shall not want. So it says, the Lord is my shepherd. That's 6 syllables. In Hebrew, it's like 4 syllables. and I shall not want is, that's 4 syllables in English, and I think it's probably 4 syllables. And it, like, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. That whole thing is 7 syllables, like the whole line, because the way you don't have is in Hebrew, there's no present tense of to be. It's just assumed. So like when it says the Lord is my shepherd, it just says Lord shepherd, But anyway, we'll talk about that, because what it does is most Hebrew poetry is divided into lines and measures. So you have one line with usually 2 or 3 measures. And those 2 or 3 measures are usually written in parallelism, but they're also usually 4 syllables, or they're short. And so the way that they would have been chanted, it would have been a very rhythmic kind of movement to the psalm. And you can't really reproduce that in English. So I find that very interesting. It actually has me thinking about wanting to learn Hebrew, because I've tried to learn a little bit of Hebrew before, but it's very fascinating. Now, one of the things that needs to be pointed out too, because we'll see as we go through the Psalms, is that so like the Gospels, that is not a common literary genre of that particular epoch, of that age. There are things that are like it, but there's nothing that is exactly like the Gospels. The letters that Paul wrote, there are epistles, and there's all kinds of critical scholarship that tries to look at how his letters look like other people's letters, and what kind of conventions he adopted in the way he wrote letters and everything. But there's nothing quite like his letters. And even with the histories, and even with Genesis, and even with these other genres and the prophetic writings, there's really nothing quite like them in the ancient world. The Psalms are super common in the ancient world. So it is a genre of writing, if you will, religious liturgical poetry that was very well known. And the Psalms copy a lot of those conventions and images and metaphors and everything else. Some of them, almost like line for line, echo Canaanite hymns to like Baal. So you could tell that they were borrowing, plagiarizing. They were taking these hymns, but then they were adjusting the content to not be about some pagan god, but to be about the God of Israel. And that's where you get some of these images, like the council of the gods. We don't think we have a bunch of gods, but in Canaanite mythology, there was a council of the gods, and Baal was, kind of like, think about like Zeus and the Olympian gods. So that those images will pop up. But like I said, it was a common kind of genre. Now, as far as the Psalms being collected, they were probably, like I said, not written, starting with number 1 and ending with number 150. They were probably collected over about 500 years. So there's no real sense that there was a single psalmist. As a matter of fact, it's almost, the commentaries always talk about the psalmist, not knowing how many there were, not knowing which ones. And I'm sure we'll see where some of them probably have some parallelism, and some of them are meant to be read in pairs, so they were probably composed together. But for the most part, these were the prayers and the hymns that were collected over Israel's worshiping life for about 500 years until they came to us in this form, which probably was not solidified until about 100 years before Christ. So it's not like it's not an ancient collection, although there are ancient psalms within it. It was kind of collected and composed and solidified over time, which I had no idea, and I think it's really cool. So there are 5 books within a psalm. So when you talk about the book of Psalms as a book and not just a collection of poems, there are some things you can say about the book of Psalms. And for one thing, they were collected into a book, so there is a book of Psalms. There's also within that 5 divisions or 5 books, and they're pretty clear because each of them ends with a doxology. So Psalm 41 is a doxology. Psalm 72 is, 89, 106, and 150. So 1 through 41, actually 3 through 41 is one collection of Psalms, and then 42 to 72 is another collection of Psalms. 73 to 89 is another collection of Psalms, and 90 to 106 and then 107 to 150. And there are some traits within those books that create some commonality between them. You know, I hope people's heads aren't spinning too much, but it's very interesting. Oh, Katie Lynn's got the lag on time on her phone. Sorry, Katie Lynn. So for instance, my other notes here, the Davidic collections, the one that claim to be from David or that reflect themes from David's life, are 3 through 41 and then 51 to 72. So that was probably the prayer book of the church. That's probably the earliest forms. And there's a lot of lament psalms in there, which is really interesting. Then the Asaphite, I know it sounds funny, doesn't it? Asaphite. The book is Psalm 50, and then 73 to 83. So kind of sandwiched in there around the David. And then the Korahites are 42 to 49, and then 84 to 89. So that kind of collection, the first two of them is called the Elohist Psalter, because it talks about God as the Most High, Elohim, which is interesting. And then you have, 120 to 134, all hymns of ascent, as people would have gone up to the temple. And then the last group of them, 107 to 150, I think it's actually 120 to 150, are all praises. So the whole book of Psalms goes from, beware of the wicked and be among the righteous. And then the end of the Psalms is this great climax crescendo of praise that ends in Psalm 150, which is a big Alleluia praise psalm. And I'm not sure, I haven't read all the commentaries yet, but I'm really excited to see what that's going to look like, because it's fascinating to me that these individually, well, in some cases individually, but that these poems that were not necessarily composed together came to be collected in ways that there was some commonality between them. And I wonder what kind of insights we're going to get from that. So I'm really looking forward to that part of it. I think it's pretty cool. Also, as far as the form of Hebrew poetry is going to be really important, because we're not well versed in Hebrew poetry, but Hebrew poetry particularly depends on something called parallelism. So when they give a line, they'll kind of repeat, so God have mercy on me, the sinner, have mercy on me who transgresses. Now, sometimes, let me see if I'm going to pull up the actual passage in the book that was talking about that, because he had a really good way of describing it. Is he says, there's a movement to those psalms. So here, for instance, this is Psalm 69. I have sunk in the slime of the deep, and there is no place to stand. I have entered the watery depths, and the current has swept me away. I am exhausted from my calling out. My throat is hoarse. I could probably read that a little bit more poetically, but you see the parallelism. So he's sunk in the slime of the deep, and there's no place for him to stand, so he's drowning. And he's, it's like quicksand. He can't put his feet on anything because he keeps sinking. I've entered the watery depths, and the current has swept me away. So now he's kind of being trapped by it. I'm exhausted from my calling out. My throat is hoarse. So he can't even call for help anymore. So there's an escalation. It either moves, where does it say? It usually moves to the particular. So it either gives a general, the first line will be something general, and the next line will be something particular. It's like my spirit faints within me, and it says I cannot stand on my own feet, or something. It'll be a more particular way of doing it. Blah 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 blah. I feel like I'm babbling at this point, so I'm going to try and collect my thoughts a little bit more. But that parallelism is very important in interpretation, because it typically is a movement to the parallelism. So when we have to pay attention to how the psalm moves from either from the general to the particular, or from the less intense to the more intense. But there's definitely a movement through the psalm, and there's even a movement through the book of Psalms, which again I find really fascinating that it all worked out this way. It is poetry, so there's a high density of rhetorical devices like similes, metaphor, hyperbole, idiomatic expressions. So what that means is you really can't read the Psalms in a literal fashion. You can't force them to mean what they say. So this is poetic language. It's self-defeating language in that it always points out, it always points to more. It points out that more is being said than can be captured in language. So think about self-defeating. If you've read poems before, it's never just the words that are on the paper. There's always something more that's evoking, something more that's drawing you into. And that's what the Psalms are. The Psalms are generally prayer, praise, or instruction, and oftentimes including multiple forms within them. So even a psalm might start out as a prayer and then break into praise halfway through. And that happens a lot as well. Let me see what other, this is my more academic notes right here. So let me go through and make sure I got all them done. Okay, so the authorship and the historical context of the Psalms is notoriously difficult to ascertain with any kind of surety. And so we'll probably shy away from doing that. But it's really important to understand that the Psalms were written in Hebrew for the people of Israel during a certain point of their history. So there is context to the Psalms, but we cannot try to constrain that too tightly. Does that make sense? But we can't forget that these were written for Israel in Hebrew. So this is not some kind of, it's not Shakespeare for the Hebrews. This was written as liturgical religious poetry to be used in services and liturgical services. So that means that it might be in the voice of David or Solomon or Moses or the Korahites or the Asaphites, but it's not historical per se. So it doesn't necessarily, so people say, oh, this psalm was written when David was hiding from Saul in the wilderness. Okay, it's written in the voice of David hiding from Saul in the wilderness, but we don't necessarily know if that psalm was composed by David in the wilderness. And so we're going to have to be careful about that. So the book of Psalms has, we talked about, so it's Torah, which means teaching. So the Psalms are meant to teach. They're not just poetry. They're actually didactic too. But what they're trying to teach us is how to pray by giving us models of prayer. And so they're also about prayer. They're, of course, about praise. We see the whole movement of the Psalms going towards praise. And they are messianic. Now, that's where we're going to get a little bit of controversy between some of the commentaries. But they're very clearly messianic in a lot of ways, which we'll see. Of course, as Orthodox Christians, we understand that you will misread the Old Testament if you don't read it through a Christological lens. Now, what does that mean? You'll hear a lot of Old Testament scholars say you can't import Christian teaching in order to try to understand the Old Testament. You have to understand the Old Testament on the Old Testament's terms. That may be true academically, and I'm not going to wade into that battle or argue with them. But from the church's teaching, the only way to understand the Old Testament is to read it with Christ in mind. Now, the way that was explained to me that I really like is think about a mystery novel, right? So I think we've talked about this in this class before, but in case some people haven't heard that. So think about some kind of a mystery novel, and you read it and you're following along, you're trying to figure out where the clues are, and you're trying to figure out who done it and all this other stuff. And then you get to the end and there's this big reveal, and all the histories are made. It was Colonel Mustard in the library with a candlestick or whatever. I know that's a game and not a book. But what that does, when you've read some kind of a detective novel or something, you get to the end and you read the big reveal. If you go back and read the novel again, it's very different. Because now you know where the false trails were. Now you know where the red herrings are. Now you know where the distractions are. Now you know where that one little seemingly insignificant detail ended up being the linchpin that put the whole thing together. And so you read it differently and you understand it because you know how the story ends. That's how we think about the Old Testament. There's all kinds of, distractions and red herrings and all sort of kind of stuff going on in the Old Testament, misunderstanding God, misunderstanding the role of Israel, misunderstanding whatever it happens to be. But when we get to the end of it and we have the big reveal in Christ Jesus, all of a sudden we go, now we have this framework for going back and understanding the whole thing. So I would argue that's true within the Psalms too, and I think we're going to see that. But we're going to have a variety of voices to choose from, but always trying to stay, of course, grounded within our Orthodox faith. There's prayers for help, there's thanksgivings, there's hymns, there's instructions, there's speeches and laments and ceremonies, consecrating the temple, and all these other sorts of things. As the theology is really fascinating over the Psalms, and they're pretty much summarized in the first Psalm, the first line of the first Psalm, which I think is really cool. And we'll talk about that a little bit. The idea is that the Psalms are written to the God of Israel, who is also the God of the whole world, the God of all creation. So there's this dual focus in the Psalms. There's this focus inward to Israel and God's covenant relationship with them. But then there's also this outward look to the nations and to the Gentiles, because the Israel was supposed to mediate God's kingdom to the nations around them. And of course, they fell into idolatry and all kinds of other missteps and everything else. But that's still true of us, is that we are meant to mediate. And I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by mediate. We're supposed to mediate God to the nations within which we find ourselves. So you'll see in the Psalms, and like I'm saying, from the very first Psalm, and I'm going to use the illuminated manuscripts for this one. Happy is the man who has not followed the counsel of the wicked, nor stood in the path of the sinners, nor sat in the seat of the scornful. So you see the parallelism. So the happy man has not followed the counsel of the wicked, or stood in the path of sinners, nor sat in the seat of the scornful, which is interesting because it would make scornful more intense than sinners, but that's a whole other thing. Rather, the teaching of the Lord is his delight, and he studies that teaching day and night. He is like a tree planted beside streams of water, which yields its fruit in season, whose foliage never fades, and whatever it produces thrives. Not so the wicked. Rather, they are like chaff that wind blows away. Therefore, the wicked will not survive judgment, nor will sinners in the assembly of the righteous. For the Lord cherishes the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked is doomed. So that first psalm actually sets up the whole theme of the book of Psalms, that the way of the righteous is cherished, but the way of the wicked is doomed. And it'll go into what it means by the wicked. We'll start seeing how the wicked are described, but primarily from the first psalm, those who follow the teaching and study the Torah are the ones that are righteous, which is kind of interesting. It's not those who are obedient, which is going to show up all over. It's not those who are rescued by God, which is going to show up all over the Psalms. It's those who study the teaching or that delight in the teaching of the Lord and study that teaching day and night. And the Psalms become how you study the scriptures day and night by making them become your prayer. So I think that's kind of cool. Which I think is fascinating. And then Psalm 2 actually opens us up. I don't know, does this do Psalm 2 in it too? I think it skips to Psalm 3. No, it skips to Psalm 8. But Psalm 2 opens up and starts to talk about the nations. Here we go. Dun, dun, dun. Why are the nations aroused and the peoples murmur vain things? Kings of the earth take their stand, princes conspire together against the Lord and against his anointed. Let us tear off their fetters, let us fling away their bonds. He who dwells in the heavens will laugh, the master derides them. Then he will speak to them in his wrath, and his burning anger dismay them. And I appointed my king on Zion, my holy mountain. Let me tell as is due of the Lord. He said to me, you are my son, myself today did beget you. You hear all this messianic stuff already happening? Ask of me, and I shall give nations as your estate, and your holdings the ends of the earth. You will smash them with a rod of iron, like a potter's jar you will dash them. And now, O kings, pay mind, be chastened, you rulers of earth. Worship the Lord in fear, and exult and tremble, pure armed, lest he rage and you be lost on the way, for his wrath in a moment flares up. Happy all who shelter him. And so, as aggressive as that psalm sounds, it's talking about God's dominion being spread over all the earth. And of course, his anointed one would be that visible king over all the earth, which of course we understand to be Christ himself. So it's so the first one is make sure you're the righteous. So it's that inward look, be righteous and keep the commandments and study the Torah. And the second one is this universal moving out to the nations, that God will be sovereign over all nations and all people will come before him. And that dual focus is played out over the whole course of the Psalms. It's about Israel's faithfulness and in addition, nations. Okay, so that's that. Let's see what I had missed. 7:35. We're doing good. Been right along, dum dibby dum. You guys remember the Muppet movie?
Yes.
Yeah, the Muppets. Okay, so now looking at St. John Chrysostom is interesting. St. John Chrysostom, he does historicize. He wants to know, when each psalm was written. But he'll, in one commentary on a psalm, he'll misquote it. Like he'll read it one way and explain it, and then later on, he'll read it a different way and explain it, which makes sense that way too. Like he has no problem with that, which I think is really cool. But some people say that that's his, one of his most significant works is his commentary on the Psalms. So I'm really excited to see how that turns out. He probably did not give those as homilies. These are probably from lectures that he would have given, or Bible study, I guess, that he did. So they're very interesting. And in Augustine, the commentary, there's some really interesting information in that introduction too. There's also, it talked about hermeneutical principles. In other words, ways of interpretive principles in reading the Psalms. And he said, the first is that they're prophetic, and that's in the classical sense of the word, that prophecy is to speak for God. So they're prophetic in the sense that it's God's voice in some of the Psalms, but it's also our voice to God in many of the Psalms. The other thing that's important, an important principle in studying the Psalms, is that they are actualizing interpretation. In other words, the Psalms are not just written to us, but they're written for us. So we need to actualize the interpretation in our lives. In other words, it's not enough just to read the Psalms, we should pray the Psalms. It's not just enough to think about the context of the psalmist in writing the hymn or writing the psalm, but we must also find that same psalm appropriated in our own lives, and how does it speak to us in our own prayer before God, which I think is really fascinating, and I'm excited about that part. And of course, Augustine's a patristic, so it must be read through a New Testament lens. We have to understand it through the lens of Christ. And then there is various meanings. There's a little meaning, there's a fitting, there's metaphor, there's all kinds of different layers of meaning. So it's multivalent is what scholars, it's multivalent. I like that. I wrote a paper when I was going to college one time, and I said, something was like a many-faceted gem or whatever. And my friend, my roommate at the time, just thought that was the most cliched, stupid metaphor, simile, whatever, that he'd ever heard. He mocked me for a year after this, the multifaceted gem. I was like, shut up. And now every time I read something about the multivalent or multifaceted, I'm like, it's not just me. Other people use tired metaphors too. But anyway, they are poetic. So they mirror ourselves. They mirror us. They reflect ourselves back to us. So there's some that we feel very drawn to, and then the emotions and the feeling of it kind of get reflected back to us. And so they diagnose our sin. They diagnose our shame. And then they also are remedy. St. Augustine calls them mirror and remedy. So they diagnose, they expose, but then they also offer therapy and healing at the same time. St. Augustine calls it the conversion of the affections, which I think is a really powerful phrase. Our affections are what we desire. They're what we're drawn to. And so we have to convert them so that our affections are aimed at the right thing. And what St. Augustine argues in his commentary is that that's exactly the purpose and the place of the Psalms, is they retrain our affections. Then there's this really cool word that I just want to show off because I can say it, is prosopological interpretation. Prosopological. Very good. So Andrew was like going like prosopological. Prosopon means face. And actually face is so here's this really cool thing. And I'm going to get geeked out on this stuff because the Psalms are they really are amazing. Just even looking at the introductions, I'm just so excited about it. But Hebrew is an extremely concrete language. It doesn't have abstractions. And Greek has a lot of philosophical abstractions because they're working that out through their philosophical tradition through the Hellenistic period. So there's a lot of abstractions. So when you read the Septuagint and it interprets some of the Hebrew idioms and everything in very abstract ways. So it'd be like, why is God no longer present to me? You can't say that in Hebrew. Presence and absence are abstract concepts. So why do you hide your face from me? Why don't you let your face shine upon me? So Hebrew's very concrete. There's really no room for it. Even when it talks about the one commentary, Alter, he's not going to use the word soul in it. So even say, so, bless the Lord of my soul and all those in me, bless his holy name. He's like, no. That imports an alien theology into the Psalms, because when we hear soul, he said, especially it's got baggage in our culture. When you say soul, you think this disembodied kind of spiritual essence that's in a dualistic kind of almost competition with the body. And if you're a good boy or girl, you get to go to heaven spiritually, and so it implies an afterlife. All those concepts are alien to Hebrew understanding, right? So you're never, and even to Orthodox understanding, honestly, because we don't believe in a soul as this disembodied secondary or dualistic kind of part. We are psychosomatic beings. We are soul and body. We are embodied, enfleshed souls. We're enfleshed spirits. We're bound together. So it's not like separate pieces. And most of the hopes and aspiration of the Hebrew people were for this life. They had a very shadowy understanding of this place called Sheol, which was really a place of mysterious kind of non-being or pseudo-being, but it's not the way we'd have thought of Hades. It's not, or the Greeks would have thought of Hades. And it's not the way that we think about heaven or hell or anything like that. So this idea of God saving me, he also, the two words he's not going to use are soul and salvation. They're not in this translation at all, the Psalms, because they don't echo the Hebrew understanding. Nephesh is the Hebrew word for soul, but nephesh is the same kind of thing as psyche, or actually is more like pneuma. So it's kind of this idea of breath, but then it's called metonymy. I actually had to look the word up because I had no idea what it meant. So metonymy is when you use a piece for the whole, a part for the whole. So if you say, oh yeah, Cleveland won the game last night. Well, Cleveland didn't win the game last night. The Cleveland Indians won the game last night, right? So you use a part of it to imply the whole. So for instance, the word for breath also would often mean your throat, is that where your breath moved through to go into your body, went through your throat. And so sometimes this process called metonymy means throat. So when you say soul thirsts for the Lord, the way it would have sounded in Hebrew is my throat thirsts for the Lord, right? Not my soul, because now you're creating all kinds of other kind of spiritualized interpretations to get into there. But Hebrew is a very embodied thing. So it says, God save me. It doesn't mean, deliver me to a glorious, pleasurable afterlife. It says, God save me. It means my foot's in the snare. I'm actually trapped, and I've got suffering besetting me on all sides, and I've got no hope, and there's no way out, and I've got no water. I didn't go to the store and buy water. I have no idea. And it's probably all sold out now. I don't have, and I don't have a flashlight even, because I'm going to use my phone. But then I realized my phone's not going to have power, and so. But anyway, I need water, I need light, and I need blankets in case whatever. So those things are very corporal. They're very embodied. They're very real and substantial. And that's going to be very important in understanding the Psalms, because they're not hyper spiritualized. They're all about the kind of nitty gritty, in the midst of life, mud and food and drink and everything else. It's all just kind of very substantial and present, which I think is really neat. Oh, so prosopological. So the face, prosopological interpretation means paying attention to what faces are present in that psalm. Who's doing the speaking? On whose behalf are they speaking? And to whom are they speaking? And so basically the characters involved. So in the psalm, sometimes it's the voice of Jesus. My God, why have you forsaken me, right? Sometimes it's the voice of Christ speaking in our name, so him as mediator before God. And sometimes it's the voice of the church in worshiping and praising God. So trying to figure out kind of this prosopological, trying to figure out who's speaking not necessarily what context it was written in, because that's, like I said, notoriously difficult to do, but to be able to sit and figure out who's speaking and who's being spoken to and what the interaction is will teach us a lot about the Psalms. Dun, 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 dun. I think that's the last thing we'll do. So that's liturgical sung poetry. Oh, yeah. So here's. So very rhythmic parallelism. Yeah, I think I got most of the details that I wanted to get though. So the ascending movement from the general to particular we talked about. It uses traditional images and stereotypical phrases, but in very fresh, evocative ways. And by the way, like I said, I'm no poet, but it was funny. All these commentators were like, they were pointing out this poetry has remained fresh and real and compelling for 2,500 years. Some of these Psalms, like I said, probably, around 1,000, so maybe 3,000. I mean, the length of time that these Psalms have been close to the heart of humans praying them is extraordinary. We talk about Whitman and Yates, right? I don't know how to say it. I'm obviously not a poet. But these guys all wrote in the last 100, 200. These poems are 2,000 years old, and we still go to them. I mean, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. I mean, think about all the times that's been prayed. We talked about how concrete Hebrew is. Words like sin and iniquity and transgression, he doesn't use much because, again, those are very abstract ideas. But things like crime or offense captures the Hebrew a little bit better. And like I said, he's going to resist the word soul and salvation because they don't. We have too much baggage associated with him, so we'll put things into it. They talk about how honest the Psalms are. Oh, Doctrine Enforcers there. Does anybody want to report him, or should we just? So I'll give you the same invitation, Mr. Doctrine Enforcers, I do everybody. If you would actually like to engage, I would love to talk to you, but I need to finish my Bible study, which will be done in about 15 minutes, and then we can talk all you want. But if you're just trolling, then we're probably going to get you kicked off. Because people on here are way more savvy electronically than I am. They know how to do it. So the other thing about the Psalms is that they are honest in almost a brutal way. So there's a lot of lament there. And the laments are not this kind of... So we have a tendency with the Psalms to kind of, like I said, over-spiritualize them. So they become, and everything's great. But a lot of the Psalms, especially the first 43, a lot of the Psalms, the lament Psalms, are about somebody struggling to remain faithful when God doesn't seem to be who he says he is. So like, but God, you said that you would, you said you'd be with me, you'd say you do this, but now I'm beset by enemies, and now my heart is taken from me, and my loved ones have fled far from me, and I'm going down to the pit, and you said that this wouldn't be, and now, but it's this struggle to try to remain faithful in the midst of all of this doubt and this frustration and this disillusionment and everything else. So the Psalms become very honest. And if we pray them, it's if we're able to pray them, then it gives us voice for the fears and the anxieties that we struggle with. Dun, 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 dun. We already talked about the underlying theology. The last thing that I'll talk about is kind of this last thing that I was just mentioning about praying the Psalms, is that the Psalms are about teaching us to pray. They're about teaching us to speak honestly to God. Most of us have created, and it's probably what Doctrine Enforcer wants to debate, most of us have created that God is kind of the sugar daddy in the sky. He's this invisible spirit fairy who sits up there, and if we say nice things and we do the right stuff and we act the way he wants us to act, then he sprinkles us with fairy dust to have happy lives. And that's not honest. That's just not true. And that's why you have so much criticism of this kind of saccharine, shallow public Christianity, because it just kind of tries to ignore the pain and the suffering and the lament and challenge of our lives. And then you get to the Psalms, and unless you completely just ignore them, you find this depth of pain and disillusionment and uncertainty But then through the back of that, you begin to see this faithfulness and this abiding in God and this trust that somehow in the middle of all of this, he will come through and be faithful. And then, of course, he does. So the first thing is they teach us to speak honestly. The other is that the Psalms, I found this really interesting, the Psalms are the only part of Scripture that come with a clear human voice. So other parts of Scripture is God revealing himself to us, even when it's written by other people. But it's all kind of captures revelation of God. But the Psalms are a revelation of us to God, which I think is a really interesting thing to think about. That it is the true expression of our doubt and our insecurity and our fear and our lament and our sorrow and our grief, but then also our joy and our praise and our hope and everything else. And then finally, the Psalms, praying the Psalms teaches us wisdom. It shows us how to pray. It shows us how to be honest to God and how to hear his voice. And it gives us words for all of the broad spectrum of human emotion that we find in the Psalms. And there are two common weaknesses in prayer that are addressed by the Psalms. The one is that prayer is always I love it when I sit with my Protestant pastor friends, and when they pray, it's always like, well, Lord, I just want it, and I just want this, and I just want it. I mean, there's this kind of rhythm to their prayer, but it's very idiosyncratic. It's something that you can tell is very singular to them. The Psalms show us that prayer can also be collective, and that when we're praying, we're joining this whole choir of witnesses. So, for instance, and we do this in Orthodoxy too, with the patristic prayers, that we don't begin by praying our own prayers because we don't think we've been taught how to pray properly. So, or we don't think that we naturally pray properly. And so we submit ourselves to being taught through the patristic prayers and through the Psalms. And so they show us what prayer looks like so that we can join that choir of voices, and then it becomes our voice as well. And the second weakness in prayer is it's a guard against religion. If you define religion as ideas about God instead of experience of God. So in this sense, the Psalms do not fit the neat kind of categories that we create for Christianity, Jesus is my boyfriend kind of stuff you hear in all the popular songs, that everything's gonna be okay and just trust in Jesus and all that kind of stuff. When no, if you trust in Jesus, probably you're going to have a lot of struggles and everything else. And if we're going to follow Christ, he says, if you're going to follow me, take up your cross and follow me. And he went to Hades. And so if we're going to go into death with Christ, if we want to follow him, that's where we have to go. And it's the hope and the confidence and the faithfulness to his resurrection, which gives us hope in passing through that there's something on the other side so that we get through the crucifixion to the resurrection in our own lives, in our own ways as well. So that is all I had. And Doctor, you jumped in too quick. I'm not ready for you yet. Before we hang out with Doctrine Enforcer here, let us figure out. Does anybody else have any questions? Oh, look at that. You figured out what my name is. Good job, Doctrine Enforcer. Okay, what kind of brainwashing is going on here, folks? The best sort. Okay, if there's usually a bit of a lag time, Doctrine Enforcer. It's kind of a very silly name. I'll just call you DE. So your questions might not pop up. Yep, Psalm 137, happy is he who dashes your children against the rocks, or something along those lines. I don't think you did it directly. That's one that's brought up a lot, and we're going to talk about that when we get to there. But it's interesting because Augustine tries to completely spiritualize that. And he says, oh, this is, we're dashing all of the immature, passionate thoughts against the rocks of, because Christ is the rock. So we're going to dash all of our temptations against Christ, and that's what's going to deliver us. But those are actually called the Psalms, imprecatory Psalms, because they're imprecation. But again, one of the human emotions is anger and vengeance and desire for retribution. And how do we deal with that? And what does it look like? And how do we bring that to God? So that's what those Psalms are. You believe God is evil? Well, you have to have a definition for all that stuff anyway. And, and you can't have evil without good. So who's going to be good? I'm a leader for a Jehovah's Witness movement. Well, that's where your confusion comes from. Every time a Jehovah's Witness comes to me, I always kind of wonder about it because they say, well, the actual syllables of his name are Jehovah. Well, they're not true. And where it comes from is the tetragrammaton, which is, well, in English, YHWH, for Yahweh. But in Hebrew, those letters, but because they didn't want to take the Lord's name in vain, they vowed it, the Masoretes vowed it with the word, the vowel sounds for Adonai, which means Lord. So you have the consonants from Yahweh with the vowels for Adonai, which makes Yahweh. And then the Germans didn't have a W sound, so they made it a V, and so you get a German mispronunciation of an improperly voweled consonantal reference to God, and you get Jehovah. So if you're going to say the actual syllables have meaning, then you should probably actually get the right syllables. Now you're getting angry. Okay, so why are you shaking scared of Jesus? I'm not scared of Jesus at all. Actually, all my hope is found in Jesus. So I'm not, and that's actually one of the things that you might be mistaking me for Protestants, because this idea of God's wrath is very present in substitutionary penal atonement theory. In Orthodoxy, we reject that. So we actually think that God came to save us and to deliver us and to rescue us in a very real way. So we do not get scared of him. Oh, you're talking about that psalm. Yeah, the context for that psalm is absolutely the Jews wanting retribution on the Babylonians for the deportation and the exile. I don't know what your message is held for review, so I have no idea. You probably weren't using the proper. Oh, that's this one right here about the Jehovah's Witnesses abusing children. Well, I have no idea. I can't speak to that. I think it's terrible what's going on in the Catholic Church right now too. Your Bible removed Yahweh 7,000 times. Oh, you're talking about how they replace it with Adonai. Well, I just explained that. That was just so they wouldn't accidentally say his name in vain. But everybody knows that that's what is being placed there. I'm always angry like the Hulk. I love that quote. He says, "I'm always angry like the Hulk. I have a crusade against Jesus." But that's one of my best scenes from the Avengers is when they go, "That's my scene." He goes, "What? I'm always angry," and turns around, the Hulk's out on the big creature. Oh, good night, Julianne. Very good. Okay, Dr. Enforcer. I mean, if you want to be angry, that's great. I'm terribly sorry. I would like to actually have a conversation with you, but I think you just want to be angry. If you actually have questions, I'll stick around for another couple minutes, and I'd love to try to address those to you. And I'm terribly. I'm getting a sense, and I don't mean to project, but I'm getting a sense that you probably had some terrible experiences within Jehovah's Witnesses. And so let me just say I'm sorry for that, because nobody should be subjected to that. And I'm struggling right now as a priest, particularly, even though we're not Catholic. People say, this child abuse that's going on, what happens everywhere. Teachers do it and coaches do it and scouts do it and all this other kind of stuff. That might be true. I suppose it even is, but teachers are responsible for the educational development of children. Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, Cub Scouts, whatever, are responsible for maybe the moral development of children. Coaches are responsible for the athletic development of children, whatever it is. But clergy, priests in particular, I would say, are responsible for the spiritual development of children and for mediating that presence of God in a way that they understand who God is to them. So for abuse to enter into that relationship, I think comes really close to the unforgivable sin. Simply because what you've done to that child is made them distrust the very place that could bring them healing from that abuse that was inflicted upon them. So I have no patience for that. And if you want to try to paint me with that broad brush, I'm not going to have much to say to you. Let me see. Oh, Jessica, Sol, and Sammy, and Paola. Hello, everybody. When does Paul get home? Anyway, I guess I'll see you guys this weekend. I am an Antichrist student. Oh, Doctrine Enforcer, don't give yourself so much credit. You're probably not Antichrist. You're probably not even close to it. You're angry, I suppose, but I don't think you can claim that. Come out and play my children of wrath. Okay, go ahead. I suppose I know. All right, Dr. Enforcer. You didn't have any questions in there, so I really would. I'd love to be able to give you some insight. I would love to be able to learn from you if you had something to teach me other than the kind of anger that's going on there. But I don't really have anything. I wish I did, because I really wish that somehow, this is the problem with being on the internet, is that there can't actually be real connection. And so without being able to look into your eyes, without being able to hear your voice and know kind of what you've experienced and what pain that's caused, I can't bring light to it. Well, I'll pray for you. I know that's in Protestant language, that's kind of a dismissal, but we'll still pray for you. And for God's mercy and light. And that's about all we can do. I don't see other questions, so I'm going to go ahead and we'll say our closing prayer. And we'll do that. You got anything, Andrew?
I do not.
No? Very good. All right.
I guess one thing I'll give you, as far as preparing for this class, do we need to read certainly, or you tell us read XYZ Psalm so that we...
Oh, that's a great question. So Andrew's saying, what do you guys have to do to prepare? Well, since I know you guys all read ahead, I don't think anybody ever read. I assigned it the first year I did Bible study. I was like, hey, have this read. And everybody came and got it. I didn't read it, Father. What I'm going to try to do, I guess that's kind of the end question we can talk about. What I'm going to try and do is figure out some groupings of Psalms and get some characteristic ones. And so as I go through the commentary, we will probably, like I said, if you want to read 1 through 41, this week, and at least you'll have them kind of in your mind. But really the best thing that the best thing I can suggest is to start praying the Psalms. Maybe even use the Kathisma. If you've got the ancient, like I said, if you've got this one, and just spend 10 minutes or something. But the Psalms are best read aloud. You can even chant them like we do in church. But that's probably the best thing to do instead of trying to read them, to study them in an academic way. Just pray them for a while, and when we get to class, I'll give you some insight into what they're talking about. But we'll probably read them in class. I'll probably show the illuminated Psalms as we go, and then we'll just talk about some of the literary commentary, maybe some illumination commentary from the illuminated text. And that's about it. And so we'll kind of figure it out from there. But I'm not really sure where we're going to go with that. So next week I'll have a clear idea of, like, are we going to do 2 or 3 Psalms a day? How much information we need to do, but we'll just see how that goes. And I'll of course take your guys' input this Sunday, or whenever I see you next. Oh, for those who are in the parish, I will likely do liturgy Friday morning, even if it's raining. If it's dangerous outside, I might cancel it because I want you guys to try to come. But my guess is that we'll have liturgy, because I think the rain's supposed to come on Saturday anyway. But that's about it. I think we have that, and then Sunday, of course, we have our regular schedule of everything. I might swim here, but I'll be here. And that's it. Should we say our prayer? Anything else? That was a good question. Thank you, because I hadn't thought of it. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. O holy apostle and evangelist Luke, make intercessions to our merciful God, that he grant our souls remission of offenses. Lord Jesus Christ, our God, please watch over these your servants, grant to say passages home, watch over, guide, and protect all those who are watching online. Please, Lord, also be with the one who came on to debate with us. Guide their heart and protect them. Help to heal the trauma and the pain in their heart. Help them to see your truth. But let it be manifest through the love that we have for one another, and not the judgment. For your holy now and forever in the ages of ages. Amen. Good night, everybody. God bless you all. Bye-bye.